Hello everyone. My name is Merit Jansen and I'm a fourth year psychology student from the Han University of Applied Sciences in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. I'm now doing an Erasmus semester abroad at the University of Pablo de Olavide. I'm involved in the project of the Women Founders, and today I will be talking about Ida B. Wells. So what am I going to talk about today? First, I'll just tell you a little bit about who Ida B. Wells is, so her biography. I will then go into more detail on the three aspects which Ida B. Wells had a very clear opinion on. Those three aspects are the equality of African Americans and women, lynchings, and economics. And if you look on the PowerPoint, you can see a picture of Ida B. Wells back in the days, so you can envision what she used to look like. To summarize who Ida B. Wells is, she was a prominent journalist, activist, and researcher in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In that time, she battled sexism, racism, and violence. As a journalist, she shed light on the conditions of African Americans throughout the South. Ida B. Wells was born in Mississippi in 1862. As an African American woman during that time, the time being the Civil War, she was born as a slave to work for parents who used their new-won freedom from the Civil War for themselves and their children. She was the oldest daughter of her parents, named James and Lizzie Wells. The Wells family were freed by the Union about 6 months after Ida B. Wells was born. As African American who lived in Mississippi, they had to deal with racial prejudices and they got restricted by discriminatory practices and rules. Once the war ended, her parents became politically active in the Reconstruction era of politics. Wells' father helped with starting up the Shaw University. This was a school for the people who just got freed from the slavery. This university is now called the Rusk College. Her parents also taught her the importance of education. Wells went to school at the Rusk College, which was, as said before, an institution that was started by white Northerners for the education of freedmen. When both of her parents died due to an epidemic, she cut her education short at the age of 16. Now she had to take care of her siblings, which is why she decided to be a teacher. She convinced the school administrator that she was already 18 years old, which is how she got the job. In 1882, Wells moved to her aunt in Tennessee together with her sisters. At one point in 1884, Wells experienced something that resulted in her activism. She had bought a first-class train ticket to go on a train ride. The crew from that train didn't let her in. They told her to move to the specific garage for African Americans, and she refused and got forced off the train. This angered her so much, and she felt so much injustice that this was an experience that let her become an activist. Later in her life, she moved to Chicago, which is also the place she met Ferdinand Barnett. Barnett was a journalist and lawyer who supported women's suffrage. They got married in 1895. She then changed her name to Wells Barnett, which was a very special thing to do during that time. She lived in Chicago for the rest of her life, and she remained politically active until the moment she died, which was in 1931. Something Wells was a big supporter of was the right to vote for African Americans and women. She was also involved in many different groups focused on the equality of them. She was a founder of the National Association of Colored Women's Club. This association was one that dealt with issues surrounding the civil rights and women's right to vote. In 1913, she also founded another association, which was probably the first black women group about the right to vote, called the Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club. And lastly, she was also part of the founding of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, also known as NAACP. But she later distanced herself from that group due to its white and elite black leadership and the fact that she felt like the group lacked action-based initiatives. E.W. Wells also wrote her own autobiography called Crusade for Justice, and the event that led her to write this autobiography was the lynching of 3 African American men in 1892. One of those men was even a close friend of Wells, and after this event had happened, she turned her attention to white mob violence. She then began an anti-lynching campaign. She became skeptical about the reasons why black men were lynched and set out to investigate several cases. She started investigating the accusations made about the African American men. For example, the accusations about the stereotype they had back then that black men always raped white women. For her investigation, she went to the scenes of the lynching and she interviewed all the witnesses. She became one of the first investigating reporters in that time. The things she found during her process, she wrote down in her columns. Those columns got a lot of hate, which led her to getting bad threats, even death threats at one point, which is why she had to move to Chicago. Later in her career, Wells traveled internationally too, with the goal to shed light on the lynching to foreign audiences. In these different countries, she openly confronted white women who ignored the lynching. But because she was one of the first people to do this in this time, a lot of people didn't share her opinion yet, which led a lot of women's organizations to making E.W. Wells look like a fool and banishing her from all these organizations. But nevertheless, that never stopped her from being active about the women's rights movement. Wells' autobiography, Crusade for Justice, which we talked about in the slide before, also provides a new way of thinking about Black death and its relationship to modern capitalism and white supremacy. Wells says that the logic of the lynching had nothing to do with criminality, but everything with the economics. According to her, lynching and mob violence were unofficial tactics from the economic point of view. It was used to protect white economic power and to make sure of the captivity of the black population, so that the black people stayed limited in gaining an advancement in economics. So on this slide you can see the APA references that I've used during this whole podcast. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Thank you for listening and goodbye.